Welcome to The Main Thing. I'm Evan MacDonald. Today I'm interviewing Stephen Galpin, a corporate property consultant with over 35 years experience in property. Stephen, could you just quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Stephen Galpin. I'm a corporate property consultant. I deal mainly with fairly large residential developments. I started many years ago in Spain, advising on buildings there. I'm a City of London magistrate and I'm a freeman of the City of London. And finally, not least, Director of Property TV.
Right. So one thing that I'm really interested in is the journey that people take to get from wherever it was that they started to where they are now. I think that's something that's very interesting for people because, for me at least, I'm fascinated in how people have taken something and made something out of it. And I think that's a fascination for a lot of entrepreneurs. So tell me about how you got started in property.
Well, I think the overriding thing is there. I'm sure we're all on a sort of predestined path in a way, because no matter how much we try and steer one way or the other, we seem to end up taking a path that's chosen for us, don't we?
There may be some truth in that.
I was one of the very first people, probably about 35 years ago, that did this sort of trip that's familiar to developers now of going to sort of Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, Hong Kong and doing pre-sales in these areas and coming back and I suppose partly responsible for some of the criticisms of today where we say a lot of people are buying property who live abroad, who are not UK residents and then just hold these properties for their kids or investments in the UK but are empty. Yeah. There is a factor in that. I had that skill because I'd worked in Spain, which was a long way in front of the UK in terms of multi-unit development.
So did you actually do your first development in Spain or get involved with your first development project in Spain?
I worked for quite a large bank there, one of the national banks.
Bank Bilbao, is that right?
That's right, yeah. And they did a development which I advised on. And
what were you doing for the bank?
Well, advising on the development, advising on the marketing,
Okay.
which in those days, crikey, 35 years ago, was so crude and probably today would be considered so naughty in the way it was done, you know. But
before you actually were taken into that role, what was your run up to that? So did you do a qualification at university? Did you have some experience that led you into that role? How did you get there? Because you're in English, obviously, and you ended up in Spain somehow in that job.
Yeah, I think originally I started in the UK. I bought one or two properties for myself, and those had been turned around and developed in a very small way.
Okay. So you had a little bit of
experience. Yeah. I had some contacts which asked me to go out to Spain and get involved in this particular work. I think they'd struggled a little bit with marketing into the UK and saw me as a sort of link between the two, which worked out quite well. But I mean, it's quite an experience. I mean, it's highly competitive there. Yeah, highly competitive. And I mean, you could see all the sort of, you'd have young ladies in fields sort of pretending to open kitchen doors and say, oh, silly me, I've got it the wrong way around, sort of pointing into the distance at the would-be swimming pool that may or may not arrive.
Right.
So it was quite a test. But I'd have to say Bank of Bilbao did a very good job on their developments. They were pretty high quality and probably in front of their time a little bit now.
So that's really interesting. Normally banks fund development. This bank was actually doing developments?
They were doing their own developments. They had their own real estate division. And do you know what? I think it worked very well. And it's a shame that some of our banks here don't take the same view. Yeah. I mean, let me take Canary Wharf as an example. 25 years ago, Canary Wharf was conceived by the Reichman brothers. They started, the tower was halfway up, and the bank said, this will never work, we're pulling the money.
When was that, when they said they were pulling the money? Was it during one of the property recessions, the 89 one?
Do you know what, I suppose that was the recession before last, so that would have been, I don't know, mid-80s?
Yes.
Mid-80s.
Late 80s, I think, wasn't it? Or,
yeah.
I don't know.
And, you thought, well, what do you mean it's not going to work? Of course it's going to work. Now, what happened in Canary Wharf in that particular development, I'd come back to London at that time. I'd actually taken some work on at Tower Bridge on some of the developments there, which was quite interesting, warehouse conversions.
So that work that you were doing was really based on the experience that you've gained
In Spain, really, yes.
For Bank Bilbao.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. So, and I was asked to look at various things in Canary Wharf. There was a lot of opportunities down there. At that time, the Docklands Development Corporation would let you build everything, you know, anything you wanted, as long as it was to building regs and it looked half decent, you could build it. It was a free-for-all.
Was pretty much
It's non-existent. And that was the whole idea of that development zone. Yeah, well, we're today, please, you know. But, you know, it has changed, I can tell you. Yeah. And it's changed to such an extent that now you're having 20 and 30-storey buildings demolished to make way for 70-storey buildings.
Yeah.
And some, you know, with almost 1,000 apartments in. And, of course, not only is the marketing difficult, but the management logistics are also difficult.
Yeah.
You know, very difficult.
Well, I think with anything, it's like a company, isn't it? The bigger the company gets, the more bureaucratic it gets. Mm-hmm. The bigger, I think, a tower is, the more, I don't know, exits and lifts and all sorts of things you've got to think about, and the more complex the management of it's got to be, I would have thought.
Well,
I've never done one, so...
It is. I mean, but, you know, you start off at basics. If you build, let's say, a 70-storey tower with 1,000 flats in it, right? Now, as a developer, you will know, you issue your completion statements at the end, and you want your money.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, the only problem is, if it's only got a small inroad, for instance, a small service road,
yeah.
I wonder how many delivery lorries of furniture you could take in a day, or people moving in. Probably three or four at most.
I can see where you're going with this.
Right. So if you bought apartment 1,000 on the 70th floor, and I say, well, give me the money, but I'm sorry, it's going to be 18 months before you can move in because your truck's got to queue.
That would end in Watford, right?
So it becomes very difficult, and developers are notoriously bad at thinking some things or doing, I think, what our government's doing at the moment over certain things, kicking the can down the road and worrying about it later. Yeah. And these are the sort of things that are actually critical to good development.
Well, you know, there's an irony within an irony there, I think, in the sense that a developer that's doing a development of that scale probably will have become quite a large and potentially bureaucratic company. Mm. And so the thing that means that not only is there a problem in terms of the mechanics of how 1,000 people are going to move in using that one service road, but also it's probably something they haven't thought through because the bureaucratic nature of the organisation means that there isn't one person whose responsibility that is. And so it's a double problem, isn't it?
And that's right. And the other thing is, of course, the planners who allow these things and the associated 106 agreements, all that sort of thing, don't take these problems into account. And I do think they should. I think a developer should be made to have a business plan of his logistics of running and operating that building.
It's interesting, actually. As a developer, what I am seeing from the planning system is more and more reports, surveys. From a developer's perspective, it's red tape. But it is required, that red tape is required in order to actually deal with those sorts of issues. The problem that it causes is it makes the planning system more and more cumbersome.
It does indeed,
yes. Which acts as a brake on development, which keeps property prices high. And it's one of the reasons, actually, why I think that this problem that we have with a difference between demand and supply of housing in this country is almost certainly not ever going to be solved. I think we can chip away at it from different angles, but I think unless we get rid of the planning system, and we're not doing that, and unless we can make it less bureaucratic, and I can't see that ever happening. I think it's a problem. It's just insolvable.
Well, I think there are a couple of issues here. One is sometimes you get people make immense steps in their development career process. You know, you get the developer that's done his mum's conservatory and then wants to do 60 stories and drags some sort of unsuspecting bank along with him.
Well,
and that's the usual situation I sort of
well,
get into, and they call me in and
yeah.
go and have a look.
I would say foolish bank in that instance.
Yeah, well, it's right. And, you know, in very buoyant times, I can't tell you how many times I've gone to look at stuff for banks, and I say, well, sorry, guys, who lent on this?
Yeah.
And they say, well, hold on, I did, but... And I say, well, didn't you come and look at it? Yeah. And they go, well, no, the figures were great.
Wow.
You know? And there's so much of that.
But, you know, it's at that point in the cycle when you see money being lent out to people who don't know what they're doing that I think you have to get concerned. And, you know, you, like me, have been through a few cycles, more than me. But it's funny because I see the same things come back in one cycle as I saw in another cycle, and I think, you know what, that's not going to end well.
Yeah. Now, look, I mean, as a developer, again, you probably won't like my view on certain things. You see, for instance, especially in the London area or Manchester or the rather more dense areas, I don't like selling off plan. Now, why don't I like selling off plan? Well, usually it's instigated by the banks. They say, we'd like to see you've got 20% sales before you get going, one thing or another. And it's a bit of a nightmare because what happens is, so you say, well, okay, I'm afraid somebody buying their home is not in a position to buy 3 years in advance or commit 3 years in advance. So these are going to be speculators, investors, buy-to-let owners that may think they're getting a great deal by buying early. But the real trouble is, you go out and you sell these, you know, you go over to Singapore or wherever, and you sell these 20% of your development. And you come back and the banks say, well, that's nice, but it's not really very secure because these are individuals, you know, and we can't go suing individuals in Singapore if they don't complete. And you say, right, well, what would you have us do? So they say, well, can you go out and get an institution to invest in a couple of floors? So, yeah, okay. So you go and get an institution to invest in a couple of floors. But of course they want a discount for doing so. So then you come back and the bank says, well, yeah, you've got some institutions investing, but price isn't very good, is it? You know? So you're really between a rock and a hard place over these things. But more importantly, it causes inflation in itself. People who want to sell their flat today will look at the pricing of these flats that are going to be ready in 3 years' time. Yeah. They'll be 30% higher than today's prices, so they'll say, right, well, I'll try and sell mine for in the middle, 15% more. Yeah. And it causes inflation. Well, that causes problems.
And the problem is that people don't ever want to take a loss on anything that they sell. And when people do, that's called a crash.
Yes. Well,
and it has a much wider reaching effect. I think that in a way is probably something that contributes to the cyclical nature of the property market.
It is cyclical and it's nothing else. I mean, when developers say, for instance, I can't sell, what can I do? What can I come up with? What can I do about this, that or the other? The answer is you probably can't, because what you're trying to do is drive a market that isn't there. No, and that becomes very expensive.
And I have from the outset, from when I started doing development, I've always thought with every development that I do, what's my fallback strategy? So in other words, if the market goes bad, what am I going to do with this? Yeah. And actually the thing that kept me going through the global financial crisis was that I built up a rental property portfolio. Interest rates dropped substantially. That gave me quite a good income from that rental property portfolio. Yeah. But also some of the developments we were doing at the time, rather than selling them as we had intended, we structured them into the investment property portfolio and just sat on them. And actually that worked really well.
Yes. And I mean, you know, one of the other things, you've sat with me on Property Question Time before. We get questions in from viewers who have varying levels of competence and knowledge. Yeah. But I think the important thing to remember is there is no God-given right to earn money from property. No. And until people understand that, we will keep having these peaks and troughs. Yeah,
look, I think actually, I would generalise that statement. I think there's no God-given right to earn money from anything. I think we have to deliver value in this world if we're to earn. You know, none of us have a right to anything. This is not going to be a very popular statement, but I believe that none of us have a right to anything unless we earn it.
No. And, you know, there's it always sounds a bit dismal, but you say you should always look on the black side just to see what your downside is. And I mean, I can tell you, I've worked for a number of developments where they've been sold off plan. And if you saw some of the heartache that I've had to listen to from people who've booked an apartment today for purchase in 3 years' time, halfway through, lost their job, want to try and get their 10 or 15% deposit back, and of course the answer is no. Or come to the end when it comes to completion and the market's changed totally. I mean, I can't tell you, again in Canary Wharf I had a particular experience. I did almost 600 apartments in 2 blocks, all sold off plan. And I was seeing people all day long with so many sob stories you just wouldn't believe. I had, you know, one young lady and who was fairly newly married, and she said, look, I can't complete on this. Hubby said sign here, so I signed here, and I know nothing about property. And I said, really? But of course I do due diligence and I understand my job. So I said to her, well, really? I said, well, what are these other 14 properties that I see that are in your name? Under ABC Buy to Let Limited.
Yeah.
Oh, those. Yes, those.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, I suppose her husband bought them too.
Yeah, we had 2 towers. I had one guy come in to me and he said, I've booked an apartment and they said I can't complete, and I really take offence at the letters I'm getting. I won't complete. My wife has just died, and I just can't cope with this. You know, you have to rescind and let me have my money back. And so I said, well, I'll have a think about it. Well, it went on for some time, and I almost forgot all about it until this chap came in to see me again, and he said, oh, I bought a flat in the tower, and it was, of course, our second tower. And I said, yes. And he said, well, I can't complete. The wife has just died. So I said, when was that? And he said, yesterday. I said, well, what about the wife you had 3 months ago when you came?
You have a very unfortunate life, don't you?
Yeah. But, you know, when you see some of the difficulties, I mean, you see people going into bankruptcy situations because they can't afford to do their sort of buy-to-let plan, on buying off plan. It's very difficult.
I've never bought off plan for investment.
No.
I thought about it a few times, but it just always seemed to me to be a very risky proposition.
Well, I think...
I've seen people make money by flipping stuff. You know, they put the 5-10% deposit down, the market goes up, they flip it, and they turn £10,000 or however much it is into 100,000 or 200,000. But
occasionally,
it sometimes happens. But I've heard far more sob stories than I've heard successes.
Well, you know, when I was a kid, my dad had worked for, it was called the post office then, it'd be Telecom now. Yeah. He'd worked all his life there. I know the first time I changed my job when I was 16, he said, what have you done that for? You've got a job. Won't you just stay with it? And that's the way life was then. Big companies were there. They were there for life, not for the shareholders' whim. But you see, today, to me, anybody that can predict their finances accurately 3 years ahead, they're pretty good.
Yeah, you're
it's
right.
a hard job.
Things move fast.
Things move fast.
They're much more chaotic.
Markets move fast.
But I do think property is a kind of constant, and I think if you take a long-term approach to property, you will always make money, but you have to be in it for the long term, and you have to make sure you're not in a situation where you have short-term pressures that will unseat you.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. My old bank manager always used to say to me, first of all, he said, property is not a 5-minute business.
No.
If you can't go in and stay in, don't.
No, exactly. I think you've got to take the approach that if you get a quick gain, then you might want to take advantage of that. But you can't go into any transaction ever.
No, but you see, that's the fundamental problem. When people do that, and I would put some developers in that category, when that does happen and you make a fast buck, and it's a substantial amount sometimes, you start to think you're, above it all, untouchable, and it's not the case. We've seen, look...
the wings of Icarus.
Yeah, I mean, look, the last real big downturn was, I suppose, 2008, 2009. It probably took 5 years to come out of that. And it's quite a clever person that knows when you are peaking again and when things are good.
Well, and it's interesting, actually, because what you've just said is probably more London centric, I would say, because from where I was
But
sitting
it
in
does flow
Gloucestershire,
out.
it didn't really start to properly get going again until probably 2015, 2016.
No, probably
So
not.
longer. And you know, London, as far as I can see, started to kind of move again in about 2011 or so, probably.
A little.
Yeah, a little.
A little. But again...
But you know, at the end of the day, once it's moved already, the buying opportunities have gone, I think.
Yeah, and you've got to look very carefully at the areas you're investing in. I mean, again, come back to Canary Wharf, you've had a situation there. It was explosive at one time. You know, prices were just rocketing. At the moment, anything over £1 million is very difficult to move. But that's because it's become what I would call a regular postcode now. It's gone from being an area where people who were involved in finance would live there, and if you weren't involved in finance, you wouldn't. You wouldn't want to come out to East London. But now it's a real postcode. It's one of the postcodes you'd tick if you're moving to London, you'd have a look at. And that's a growth. But because of that growth, it's actually taken down the tier at the top level of the property market. So we've got less bankers who are on hundreds of thousands, if not many millions of pounds a year. We've got more support workers who previously would live perhaps in Stratford or in Ilford, coming into the Wharf and wanting to live there. So the spread has...
Well, I think also there are some macro effects that are hitting that. So obviously there's a great deal of uncertainty about what's going to happen in terms of Brexit. That's no doubt had an impact on decisions about whether or not expansion happens in the finance sector in the UK. That will have certainly had an impact. But also, I think the market has undergone a structural change in the sense that the overseas investors are no longer investing in the UK. That market has almost disappeared, and so people who are buying properties generally now are buying them to live in, and so
that's a different game altogether.
Well, exactly, and it relies on affordability, and there aren't so many people who can actually afford those apartments at that sort of £1 million plus price.
I think also when you develop an area, as I say, I started off really in London at Tower Bridge. Now, when I first went to Tower Bridge, Shad Thames was a sand track.
Right.
There was the one warehouse there.
I looked at a flat in Shad Thames in about 96.
Right.
And it was £200,000. God knows what it would be now. It was overlooking the river as well.
Well, yeah.
And I would have thought that would be 2 million now.
It probably would. But it has taken 20 years.
Yeah.
And the catalyst for that was the Mayor's Building.
Yeah, but and there was what?
That was the catalyst, the Mayor's Building.
Yes, yeah. But I think that kind of underpins the point that I was making earlier. In the long run, property is always a good investment.
Well,
but in the meanwhile, things went like that.
Yeah, but here in London, we have some of the safest, mature property legislation that has ever been anywhere in the world. If you buy a property in London or in any of the centres, even if you're not getting freehold, you're only getting leasehold, you know it's safe, you know it's correct, you know the title is correct, you have central government land registry, and that's what attracts investors to London overall.
And it's one of the things that attracts international investors. So, you know, that market will come back almost certainly. Britain is a very safe place to put your money, and that's not going away anytime soon.
Irrespective of Brexit. Do you know what? I think when people are... I know Mark Carney came out and said he expected, or we should all anticipate, a 20 to 30% drop.
Well, there's a nuance there, actually. That's the way the press reported it, but it isn't actually what he said. What he said is that the worst case with a no-deal Brexit would be that, but he outlined a range of scenarios. And so what the press did, as they tend to do, is they reported the worst case, because that makes the best news. It's the most dramatic thing.
Yes,
exactly. So actually, I think he said that on average he thought it might be 5 or 10%.
But there's always that caveat for the banks, isn't it? What do they say? If they're not right today, they were last week.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
so there we are.
And then, you know, there's another thing actually that I like to sort of, it's an interesting way of thinking about predicting recessions. If you predict one for long enough, you'll be right.
Yeah,
because there's always going to be another one, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. But, you know, again, making things work. I was fortunate enough to interview one of the guys that was pivotal in doing all the Canary Wharf commercial letting.
Yeah.
I asked him, I said, well, what did you see that the banks didn't see? Because I go down into the malls there now. I mean, this is the high street argument. See, my view is the high street hasn't died. The high street has changed. And the high street's a different animal now.
Yeah.
And I think the high street is the malls down here. Now, the thing about that is, he said, look, instead of being the usual institutional landlord, he said, I thought what I'd do, instead of trying to get the biggest shops to pay the biggest rent for the longest period of time, I'd actually analyse the demographics of the people that were going to be here and spending in those shops. And so what I did, if the shops didn't fit that demographic, they didn't get a lease. And I took the hit on it originally, but overall it's turned all the malls into a huge success, so much so you can almost not get in at lunchtime, you know. And it's that approach to property development that we need. You know, we're talking
one
about
that's more focused on what it is that people actually want.
Well,
trying to put that together, is that what you're
putting it together, but also the strategic planning from planners. Again, I was lucky enough to interview one of the mayor's senior advisors on town planning, and you know, I've been in the property business a long time, but I was absolutely astounded at the lengths that they go to where there is a new town situation for either regeneration or refurbishment. The amount of planning and thought that goes into that now, I mean, you can take it down to health, down to diabetes. They'll say, right, well, we don't want too many cake shops. I won't have 2 cake shops together. We'll only allow 1 in this zone. We'll only allow 1 KFC, not 2, you know. Starbucks, yes, 1. Not the Starbucks thing of, well, we want you to walk no more than 3 minutes to the next one. That's all gone. And the town planners now are being so pedantic about this. I mean, it's great news in a lot of ways, because property affects our lives. It affects our lives and the way we live.
Yeah. I agree with you, although I'm no advocate of central planning. I think the demise of the Soviet Union is probably enough to convince us that communism as a concept doesn't work. But there is a balance, and I think as with
There's some that say it would work.
I'm sure our friend Mr. Corbyn.
Yes, I'm sure. Yes,
not my friend, but would say that it works. But and actually, it's an argument that can be made, and it's a philosophical argument. And if you make the argument in the right way and you believe certain things, then you're going to think that you're right. I don't happen to believe that, but I do think that, as with many things in life, it's about balance. I think you need a degree of informed and well thought through regulation in order for things to work. I don't believe that raw capitalism without any form of rules or regulation is a good thing, but neither do I believe that central planning is a good thing. I think it's about how do we balance public interests and private interests, and do so in a way that's as fair as possible. The system will never be fair, because if it's fair, there are no incentives for people to go out and push themselves.
I think there are two things there. One, again, we've sat on panels where people say, "What's the market doing?" Now, what do you mean, the property market? There are 20 different sections of the property market.
And
20 different disciplines, geography.
Yeah.
So that's that. And of course, the other issue, in the bigger towns, we are living in more densely populated environments. So we do have to learn to live together better as people.
I agree, and I think these community-based forms of living are going to have a
huge
impact.
I think they are. I think you're right. Yeah. Well, there's a lot to put right with the market. I've been trying for years and years and years. I don't think I might be responsible for some things.
Sure. Well, we're never going to reach nirvana. It's a journey, not a destination. I think we just have to try and enjoy that journey and do what we can to actually contribute and help other people along the way.
But the one thing I would say, sort of finally today, is that I do look round, and I think in this last, I'd say 5 years more than anything. In this last 5 years, we are now starting to leave behind buildings we can be proud of. The days of the awful blocks of the 70s, the first attempts at tower blocks, they're gone, they're going.
Yeah, look, that's really interesting, because that's sums up the thing that drives me to do development. This building here is something that I'm really proud of because of the way that it fits into the streetscape, because it's contemporary. To me, it's a beautiful creation, and the thing that really drives me is to be able to be proud of what it is that I've created and to be able to stand back and look at that.
Yes.
Now, I need to make a profit with what I do because otherwise I couldn't keep doing it. It has to be sustainable. But that's not what motivates and drives me. What motivates and drives me is to actually deliver beautiful buildings. And so I consider myself lucky to have the opportunity to do that.
Well, you talked about balance. I think you've done a great job with this development, and it is balanced and it's very attractive, and it does sync with the surroundings. So well done.
Thank you, Stephen. It has been a pleasure speaking to you today. Thank you for taking the time to do it. And,
thank you for inviting me.
This is The Main Thing. I'm Evan Maindonald. Thanks for watching or for listening. I'll see you all again soon.